Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to read. I don't know how the other two did it. I have to stay focused. For those of you who have experienced caring for a loved one who is dying or know someone who has, you know it can be daunting and overwhelming, particularly in the final months and days. Gateway House of Peace is a not-for-profit, round-the-clock care comfort home for people in their final days who have no other or few other options for care. What does that mean? We're a home just like yours, but we have trained staff providing skilled care 24 hours a day. We're not hospice, but partner with them just as you would. We don't charge our residents or their family. They will never get a bill from Gateway House. We're not funded by the government, and we're not eligible for insurance reimbursement, which means we exist for our community, by our community. It is through donations and fundraisers that Gateway House provides a safe, peaceful place for people to die with dignity, and for their family and friends to just share that time, free of the burden of care and financial distress. Our storyteller will ever so eloquently share this with you. Our home is often referred to as heaven, and our caregivers as angels.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I remember the evening so clearly. The evening I reached my breaking point. At the time, we couldn't foresee the future. We didn't know my mother had only 4 days left to live. It was like running a race, and we didn't know where the finish line was. So we didn't know how to pace ourselves, how much time to take off of work. There were full-time jobs, family estrangements, and in the midst of our busy lives, the person we were all closest to was dying. It was the Thursday evening before Memorial Day. My mom, Nancy, had been admitted into hospice care with end-stage pancreatic cancer Mother's Day weekend and was in a hospital bed in the family room. My dad was her primary caregiver for hospice purposes, but the truth was he couldn't attend to her needs on his own, and he didn't want to admit it. My 2 siblings and I made a schedule to ensure one of us was at the house as often as possible to support our parents. My shift would begin later the next day, and that night I realized it was beyond what I could handle. My mother's physical condition had deteriorated throughout the week. Each day, her windows of lucidity closed more. Within a day or two, she became fully bedridden, and it was exceptionally difficult to understand what she was trying to say. One evening, I arrived at their house, and my mom was calling to my dad because she needed something. Her voice was weak, and he couldn't hear her because his hearing wasn't great. The television was quite loud, and he probably had nodded off again. So as much as my mom had wanted to die at home, it wasn't the safest environment for her. There were lots of stairs in their split-level home, and at times I found her on them alone, which wasn't supposed to happen. Also, her medication schedule was confusing. We did our best to care for her at home and made frequent, frantic calls to hospice to send a nurse out to help with the basics, like repositioning her without causing her undue pain. A hospice nurse would come over and make it look so easy. We felt like incompetent caregivers and nuisances. We were really struggling. See, my mom was the only extrovert in the family. She was the hub of the communication wheel. She was the one everyone went to, and then she'd relay the news to others. With her down, we introverts had to communicate directly for the first time ever. It was awkward and unskillful. Like most families, there were issues, unresolved conflicts, shame. I drove home from my parents' house that Thursday evening feeling desperate for a solution, but there was nothing on my radar. Well, the next morning, I prayed for a solution and then got busy researching. Private in-home care was very expensive, especially because we didn't know how long we'd need it. The hospice social worker called to tell me Gateway House of Peace had a bed available and that my mom could be transferred there the next morning. It wasn't the first time Gateway had been presented as an option. However, my dad wanted to honor my mom's wishes to die at home, and my mom wasn't lucid enough to weigh in. My dad was also largely in denial of the reality that his beloved wife of 50 years was really dying and didn't want to talk with the hospice social worker, which is why I was on the phone with her. Gateway sounded like a great solution to me. The challenge was to convince my dad. It's clear now that he had no control over keeping my mom alive, and the one thing he had control of was honoring her wishes. But we needed help. Somehow, I convinced him to let Sandy from Gateway come over for an informational visit, which took place immediately and was followed immediately by a trip to Gateway to see for ourselves. When we arrived, Patty gave us a tour. Her friendly personality and sparkling eyes reminded my dad very much of my mom and put him at ease. Meeting Patty and the other staff and volunteers, we knew in our hearts Gateway was the right place for my mom, where she would receive the compassionate, round-the-clock care she needed and deserved. At that point, my dad's only hesitation was disbelief that Gateway was free. He thought it was too good to be true and wondered what the catch was. But there was no catch. So the next morning, my mom was transferred to Gateway. What a blessing to have the burden of her physical care lifted from us, leaving us with more energy to give her love and comfort and to be her family rather than her bumbling nurses. And that's when some joy began to filter in, and some small miracles as well. For instance, my mom had a dear friend in her 20s who was one of her bridesmaids. They hadn't been in touch in decades, but all of a sudden, without knowing my mom was sick, this woman searched for her online and found me the same day I was praying for a miracle. The day after my mom was admitted to Gateway, this woman and her husband drove from New Jersey to be with us. And although my mom was cocooning deeply and was virtually unresponsive, we gathered around her bed and listened to her friend share memories of their times together so many years ago. My husband is a musician, and I'd asked him to play guitar and sing for my mom as she had done for hospital patients as a volunteer before her health declined. So when the time was right, he took out his guitar. My mom was a huge John Denver fan, and we sang some of his songs like she used to. We filled that room with joy and music. It was a celebration. My mom became alert enough to indicate she could hear us. It felt as if she were on a raft rather than a hospital bed, and we were on the shore giving her a joyous send-off. The Gateway staff gave us all the space and privacy we needed, for which I'm grateful. Now, there's 2 patient rooms at Gateway. My mom was in the blue room, which was perfect because blue is her favorite color and because it offered a view of the Saratoga County Airport runway. Earlier in life, my mom was a stewardess. And that evening, I had a vision of her as her younger flight attendant self awaiting takeoff. Well, we had one more day with my mom before she passed. I witnessed the tenderness with which she was touched, spoken to, and cared for. It blew me away. I think it was Sandy who explained that to her, my mom was her own mom. The angels at Gateway continue to express love for their own dear ones through loving the dying people in their care as if they were their own family. They're also there for the whole family, a comforting, supportive presence in the living room. When the staff and volunteers were made aware of a tender situation some family members were ashamed of, they didn't bat an eyelash. There was just compassion. On my mom's last evening, rifts were put on hold, and everyone gathered around her bed. The sunset sky, visible through her windows, was lovely. The atmosphere felt calm and sacred. We played her favorite music CDs softly all evening, and in the middle of leaving on a jet plane, a small jet actually took off, but she kept breathing. That night, some of us stayed overnight. My dad went home, and before leaving, he gave my mom a kiss and told her to hang in there, and he'd be back in the morning. In that moment, I understood what she was waiting for. I took my dad aside and told him he needed to give her permission to die. Tell her it's okay to let go. So he did. My two teenagers camped out in one of the upstairs bedrooms, watching movies together. I retreated to the other when I needed some rest, and one of my siblings stayed in the comfortable recliner next to our mom's bed. We were able to be under the same roof in what felt like our own space, titrating our attention. A little after 2 a.m., my son felt compelled to go downstairs to say goodbye to Grandma. This awakened my sibling in the recliner, who had some meaningful moments with her before her eyes, which had been closed all day, opened wide and bright for several seconds. She looked toward the door and then slipped away with the most transcendent, peaceful look on her face, which was both a comfort and a blessing to my dad when he returned in the morning. The volunteers and staff at Gateway shared such intimate, personal moments and truly became family. And you might expect the story to end there. However, there's more. My dad began stopping by Gateway shortly after my mom died. In the beginning, it was to drop off donation checks, but soon it was to visit his new friends. He developed a deep friendship with Patty and Joni, the founder of Gateway. My dad passed away less than a year and a half after my mom, but the Gateway family helped to fill a deep hole in his life. I find it almost impossible to believe that my mom never got to know them because she would have loved them. And she would have been immensely grateful for the care and friendship they gave us. And as for those little miracles, blessings, synchronicities, or whatever you want to call them, perhaps they are more abundant than we realize, and we tend not to notice them because we're preoccupied in our thoughts and with our busy lives. Gateway took so much of the weight off of us so we could be more present and aware of the magic moments happening amidst the suffering. It's been more than 8 years, but when I think back to that time and what it was like and what it felt like when my mom finally was admitted to Gateway, my whole body breathes a sigh of relief.
taking us further apart. Weren't we lucky to have you right here, binding us close in your heart? How could we know how you held us together until you started to fade? What can we do to make it forever? How do we know where to start? Isn't it something that angels are real and waiting to give us their hands? Weren't we needing to hear someone say how much that they understand? How could we know that a place of peace was waiting to shoulder our care? When we were drowning in an ocean of pain, we stepped into light and found land, and it felt like family. It's all right now, it felt like family. It's real somehow, it felt like family. Oh, oh, oh. Isn't it lovely to be here this way? Oh, sharing the times of your life. You happy to see an old friend sitting right here by your side? How could we know as that jet soared away, it carried your soul to the sky? I wish I could make this day last forever and always live in this life, 'cause it felt like family. It's all right now, it felt like family. It's real somehow, it felt like family. Oh, it felt like family. Oh, it felt like family. It felt like family.